The date is November 14th, 1940. Inside RAF Fighter Command, a message arrives that drains the color from every officer's face. Across occupied France, 500 German bombers are gathering. They aren't dispersed randomly. They aren't conducting reconnaissance. They're organizing in tight formation, and this can mean only one thing. What's coming isn't just another raid. What's coming is annihilation. Tonight, a British city will be erased from the map. Around the plotting table, officers watch as fresh coordinates appear moment by moment. They observe the bomber force assembling. British radar, the same technology that rescued them during the Battle of Britain mere months earlier, functions flawlessly. They're aware the Germans are approaching. They understand roughly when they'll arrive. Yet this knowledge proves insufficient. These bombers navigate not by celestial bodies or ground features like aviators did in the previous war. They're directed by something unseen, something terrifyingly accurate. Radio transmissions that cut through weather, penetrate fog banks, bypass every natural barrier that should render night bombing impossible. The Germans have named this guidance technology Knickebein, the bent leg. Hitler himself has assured his commanders that tonight's operation will demonstrate its invincibility. Meanwhile, in a cluttered Air Ministry office, a young physicist pores over radio frequency information his commanders ordered him to disregard. Dr. R.V. Jones is 28 years old. He possesses no military authority worth noting. High-ranking officers characterize his German radio navigation theories as delusion and squandered effort. One air marshal recommended his transfer to more productive work. Still, Jones continues examining the data. Something exists within those frequencies, a sequence everyone else overlooked. Should his absurd hypothesis prove accurate, should he actually be correct, he can reveal Germany's complete bombing doctrine. He simply requires someone willing to believe him. He has fewer than 6 hours before those bombers cross onto British territory. Understanding how one dismissed scientist rescued London from obliteration requires going backward to when Britain fought entirely alone, and Germany controlled the skies. The summer of 1940. France has collapsed. The British Expeditionary Force barely survived evacuation at Dunkirk, abandoning tanks, weapons, and any fantasy that victory would come quickly. Hitler's Wehrmacht dominates territory from Norway down to the Spanish frontier. Britain remains the final obstacle standing, and nearly everyone, including numerous British generals, anticipates its surrender before year's end. The Luftwaffe commands the airspace. German aircraft assault British cities with horrifying consistency, initially targeting airfields, subsequently ports, then manufacturing centers, and progressively residential areas. The Blitz has commenced, and British urban centers ignite nightly. London, Liverpool, Birmingham, Southampton. The conflagrations illuminate the darkness across vast distances, and each dawn reveals fresh destruction, fresh victims, fresh mourning. Yet something troubles the intelligence analysts who endure long enough to study the patterns. The bombing demonstrates excessive precision. This differs from the random devastation of the Great War, when aviators released explosives manually and hoped for impact. German bombers strike designated structures, designated street corners. They're delivering ordnance through weather conditions that should render accuracy unattainable. One assault demolished an aircraft engine manufacturing plant while leaving the residential avenue 50 yards distant, completely intact. Another struck an ammunition depot concealed within woodland, a target invisible from altitude even during daylight hours. How? This question plagues RAF intelligence. German aviators cannot perceive through cloud formations. They cannot orient themselves by landmarks when landmarks remain invisible, yet their munitions land precisely where intended, night following night, city following city. Something guides them, something Britain cannot identify, and unless they discover it, unless they comprehend it and neutralize it, the war has already concluded in defeat. The solution resides in technology so straightforward it approaches brilliance, and so catastrophic it revolutionized combat permanently. Knickebein operates on logic any radio hobbyist could grasp. Picture 2 radio broadcasting stations positioned along France's coastline, separated by multiple miles. Each station projects a concentrated beam of radio signals aimed across the English Channel toward Britain. These transmissions differ slightly from one another. One broadcasts a sequence of dots in Morse code, the other broadcasts dashes. A German bomber aviator adjusts his radio receiver to the Knickerbein frequency and monitors the audio. Should he detect only dots, he's drifted excessively left. Only dashes indicates excessive drift right. However, when positioned exactly on trajectory, flying precisely along the beam's center line, the dots and dashes blend into unbroken tone, a constant hum indicating he's perfectly synchronized with his destination. The aviator requires no visual confirmation, requires no landmarks or celestial navigation or even operational compass. He simply tracks the audio. The secondary beam crosses the primary beam directly above the target. When the aviator's receiver identifies that intersection, a distinct modification in the audio pattern, he understands he's reached the objective. He drops his payload, in complete blackness, through impenetrable meteorological conditions, and impacts his target within 100 yards. German technicians had been refining this apparatus since 1938. They'd resolved challenges that British scientists declared insurmountable. Radio transmissions travel in linear paths, yet Earth's surface curves. Theoretically, a beam transmitted from France shouldn't penetrate deeply into Britain. It should project into space as the planet curves beneath it. The Germans learned that under specific atmospheric circumstances, radio signals bend minimally. They refract following Earth's curvature, imperfectly yet sufficiently. Sufficient to direct a bomber from Calais to Coventry with nearly surgical accuracy. Hitler maintained such confidence in Knickerbein that he allegedly informed his air commanders the system was invisible and invincible. The British possessed radar, certainly. They could observe incoming bombers. Yet radar identified aircraft, not radio transmissions. The guidance apparatus itself remained undetectable. The Luftwaffe could assault any British target with precision that defenders couldn't oppose because they couldn't even recognize the danger. At minimum, that represented German belief. Reginald Victor Jones never aspired to espionage. His ambition was physics, legitimate academic physics involving infrared radiation studies and publishing research that colleagues would reference. He'd obtained his doctorate at Oxford at 24, younger than most contemporaries, and his professors expected he'd vanish into some university laboratory for an unassuming career of research and instruction. Then war arrived, and someone within British intelligence recognized a deficiency. The military comprehended weaponry and vessels and strategy. They didn't comprehend science, and this modern war, this mechanized technological catastrophe spreading across Europe, depended on science, radar, radio, cryptography, weapon systems that generals couldn't understand, much less counter. Britain required individuals who could reason like scientists, yet operate like intelligence operatives. Individuals who could examine fragments of technical information and perceive the weapon under construction. They located Jones. More accurately, Jones located them. He'd authored research during doctoral studies about utilizing infrared detection for nocturnal aircraft identification. Someone at the Air Ministry reviewed it and concluded, "This young man approaches military challenges the way we require people to approach military challenges." They enlisted him in 1939, provided him a cramped office, a meaningless designation, and virtually no funding. He was instructed to examine whatever technical intelligence arrived at his desk and report anything noteworthy. What arrived at his desk was predominantly rubbish, gossip, conjecture, outlandish theories from aviators who'd observed unusual illumination or detected strange sounds. Yet Jones didn't reject anything immediately. He documented, he organized, he cross-checked, and gradually a configuration began materializing from the disorder. Multiple sources, disconnected, reporting at separate intervals, referenced radio beams. A captured German airman inadvertently revealed something about pursuing the signal. A resistance operative in occupied Holland reported peculiar radio transmitter assembly near the shoreline. A technical examination of a downed German bomber discovered radio apparatus calibrated to frequencies that didn't correspond with any recognized German transmission. Individually, these fragments meant nothing. Collectively, they suggested something extraordinary, something the Germans were constructing. Something involving radio technology and bomber navigation. Jones compiled documentation. He drafted memoranda. He attempted alerting his superiors. The response was dismissive. Senior officers explained, patiently, condescendingly, why he was mistaken. Radio beams capable of guiding aircraft across hundreds of miles? Technically implausible. The technology didn't exist. German engineering, however sophisticated, couldn't overcome fundamental physics limitations. Jones was pursuing phantoms. He should concentrate on realistic threats. Yet Jones couldn't release the concept. The evidence persisted in accumulating. Additional reports, additional frequency anomalies. And the bombing accuracy continued improving. German aircraft were striking targets they shouldn't be capable of locating, during conditions they shouldn't be capable of navigating. He required proof. Definitive, irrefutable proof that would compel even skeptical senior officers to acknowledge the threat. He required someone to actually locate these supposed beams and validate their existence. That someone materialized in the form of a specialized RAF reconnaissance unit. Secretly, without official authorization, Jones persuaded them to fly specific routes while monitoring particular radio frequencies. What they discovered transformed everything. June 1940. An RAF Anson reconnaissance aircraft follows coordinates Jones provided. The crew maintains extremely low altitude, virtually skimming treetops, to position themselves where radio transmissions should be concentrated if Jones's hypothesis is accurate. They've been instructed to monitor 31.5 MHz, the frequency Jones theorized Germans were utilizing. Initially, nothing. Static. Atmospheric interference. The typical radio noise that permeates any frequency. The crew begins doubting. Perhaps Jones was mistaken. Perhaps this entire operation is squandered time and aviation fuel. Then they detect it. Faint initially. A rhythmic pattern. Dots. Morse code dots transmitted in steady sequence. The pilot adjusts trajectory slightly. The dots diminish. He corrects. The dots intensify again. He maneuvers the aircraft systematically, tracing the signal's strength, and comprehends what he's discovered. He's inside a radio beam, an actual physical radio beam transmitting from somewhere across the channel. The beam is concentrated, approximately 400 to 500 yards broad, and extends directly toward Britain's interior. When he's centered within it, the dots and dashes merge into continuous tone, exactly as Jones predicted. The crew traces the beam backward to its origin point on the French coastline. They trace it forward deep into English airspace. They measure its width, its strength, its characteristics, and they document everything. When they return and present their findings to Jones, he experiences that rare sensation of vindication that comes from being definitively, measurably correct after everyone declared you wrong. He possesses his proof. The beams exist. The Germans actually constructed an invisible guidance network across British airspace. Now he simply needs to determine how to dismantle it. Jones's discovery reaches Churchill within days. The Prime Minister, unlike numerous military officials, immediately grasps the implications. If Germans can guide bombers with such precision, no British city remains secure. No factory, no port, no strategic installation can be adequately defended. The entire defensive strategy Britain has constructed, radar detection, fighter interception, anti-aircraft artillery, becomes irrelevant if they cannot disrupt the guidance apparatus directing the bombers toward their targets. Churchill convenes an emergency conference. Senior military leadership attends, technical specialists, intelligence chiefs, and Jones, probably the youngest, definitely the least experienced individual present. He's invited to explain his findings. Picture the scene. This cramped conference chamber, maps covering every wall surface, senior officers who've commanded forces and planned campaigns, and this young physicist, no military rank, no command experience, informing them they've fundamentally misunderstood the war they're fighting. Jones describes Nicobine. He explains beam navigation theory. He presents the reconnaissance findings. He demonstrates, utilizing mathematics and physics that most attendees don't fully comprehend, exactly how Germans have resolved supposedly impossible technical challenges. The reception is skeptical. Some officers still question whether this represents genuine threat or elaborate misinterpretation. Others accept the threat's existence but argue nothing can be done. You cannot disrupt radio transmissions from occupied territory. The beams originate from German-controlled France. British forces cannot access the transmitters to destroy them. Therefore, they're compelled to endure the bombing until circumstances change. Jones disagrees. And here his brilliance manifests most clearly. He doesn't merely identify problems, he engineers solutions. The beams themselves cannot be eliminated, he explains. However, they can be corrupted, distorted, rendered unreliable. Radio transmissions aren't invincible. They're vulnerable to interference, to jamming, to deception. And if British countermeasures prove sufficiently sophisticated, German aviators will lose confidence in their guidance system. Perhaps immediately, perhaps gradually, regardless, eventually. He proposes multiple strategies, some straightforward, some ingenious, some bordering on absurd. Yet Jones has demonstrated his absurd concepts occasionally prove accurate. His initial recommendation, construct British transmitters that broadcast on identical frequencies as German beams, overwhelm the German signal with British static, create so much interference that German receivers cannot distinguish genuine guidance signals from noise. Designation: Operation Headache. Second strategy, more sophisticated. Don't merely jam the signals, bend them. Transmit false beams that mirror German beams but point toward incorrect locations. German aviators will pursue what they believe is their guidance beam and discover themselves off target. Perhaps slightly, perhaps significantly, sufficient to preserve lives and infrastructure. Designation: Bromide. Third strategy, most audacious, meakening. Capture German navigation signals, amplify them, and retransmit them with slight delays. German aviators attempting to triangulate their position utilizing multiple beams will receive confused, contradictory information. Their guidance system will indicate they're approaching their target when actually they're miles away. These aren't guaranteed solutions. They're experimental, untested. They require resources Britain scarcely possesses, yet Churchill recognizes their merit. He authorizes immediate implementation. Jones receives authority to construct his countermeasure apparatus. The race against German bombing has transformed into an invisible technological conflict, a war within a war conducted in radio frequencies nobody can observe. The initial countermeasures prove remarkably effective. Within weeks of Headache's activation, intelligence reports indicate German bomber crews complaining about navigation difficulties. Some abandon missions entirely when their guidance signals become unreliable. Others reach what they believe are their targets only to release bombs over empty countryside. The Germans notice. Obviously, they notice. Their precision bombing campaign has suddenly become imprecise. Factories they intended to demolish remain operational. Cities they targeted for destruction sustain minimal damage. Something has disrupted Knickebein. German engineers respond by upgrading their systems. They increase transmission power, rendering jamming more difficult. They modify frequencies, forcing British countermeasures to locate new signals. They develop more sophisticated beams, X-Juret and Y-Juret, employing different technical principles that Jones's initial countermeasures cannot affect. Each German innovation triggers British response. Each British countermeasure provokes German counter-response. The cycle accelerates. Both sides pour resources into this invisible struggle that most populations remain unaware exists. Jones's team expands. He recruits physicists, engineers, radio specialists. They work continuously, analyzing captured German equipment, monitoring frequencies, developing new jamming techniques. The work is exhausting and relentless. Every night German bombers attack. Every night British countermeasures attempt disrupting them. Some nights succeed. Some nights fail catastrophically. November 14, 1940 represents one of those catastrophic nights. Coventry, an industrial city in England's center, crucial for manufacturing. Home to aircraft plants, munitions factories, engineering workshops. Exactly the type of target Germans desperately want eliminated. Jones's intelligence network has detected unusual German radio activity. Multiple beam transmitters activating simultaneously. Bomber formations assembling in unprecedented numbers. Everything indicates a massive raid approaching. The target, Coventry. Jones informs command. He explains what his analysis reveals. 500 bombers. Multiple guidance beams ensuring they locate the city even in complete darkness. This won't resemble previous raids. This will be systematic obliteration. The question becomes, can they stop it? Jones implements every countermeasure available. headache transmitters operating maximum power, bromide beams attempting to deflect German bombers, beaconing systems generating false navigation signals, fighter squadrons positioned along probable approach routes, anti-aircraft batteries alerted. Everything Britain possesses mobilized for Coventry's defense. It proves insufficient. The German raid succeeds. Hundreds of bombers locate Coventry precisely as intended. They deliver their payloads with devastating accuracy. The city center ignites. Factories explode. Residential areas collapse. By morning, substantial portions of Coventry have been annihilated. Hundreds dead. Thousands injured. Historic cathedral reduced to ruins. The raid represents catastrophic failure for Jones's countermeasures. The beams functioned. German guidance systems overcame British interference. The nightmare scenario Jones attempted preventing has occurred. Yet within this disaster exists crucial information. Jones's team analyzes everything about the raid. Which countermeasures functioned? Which failed? Why German beams penetrated their interference? What modifications Germans implemented? They learn. And learning, they adapt. Post-Coventry, the beam war intensifies. Jones comprehends he cannot simply disrupt German signals. He must make them untrustworthy. He must create situations where German crews cannot distinguish genuine guidance from false guidance. His new approach involves subtlety rather than force. Instead of overwhelming German beams with static, British transmitters generate signals almost identical to German beams. Same frequency, same characteristics, except slightly misaligned. German aviators receive two beams, one authentic, one counterfeit, and cannot determine which to trust. Psychological impact proves as significant as technical effect. German bomber crews begin questioning their instruments. Is this steady tone indicating correct course, or British deception? Some crews continue trusting their guidance systems. Others abandon them entirely, reverting to traditional navigation methods, which proves disastrous during cloud-covered nights. German command recognizes their beam technology has been compromised. They respond by developing increasingly sophisticated systems. Ex-Jurat employs multiple intersecting beams, theoretically more difficult to counterfeit. Y-Jurat utilizes different operational principles entirely, attempting to circumvent British countermeasures. Each new German system presents fresh challenge for Jones's team. Each challenge demands fresh solution. The technological escalation becomes perpetual competition. Germans innovate, British counter-innovate. Germans adapt, British counter-adapt. Resources flow into this invisible conflict. Both nations invest heavily in electronic warfare capabilities that didn't exist before the war. New scientific disciplines emerge: signals intelligence, electronic countermeasures. The entire field of what eventually becomes modern electronic warfare traces its origins to this desperate struggle between Jones's team and German engineers. By 1941, German beam navigation has become substantially less reliable. Bomber crews report constant guidance failures. Missions abort because navigation systems prove untrustworthy. The precision bombing campaign Hitler envisioned, surgical strikes eliminating British industrial capacity, has degraded into approximation and guesswork. Britain survives the critical period. Not because German bombing ceases, it continues through 1941 and beyond, but because it loses its devastating precision. Factories damaged, but not destroyed. Cities damaged, but not obliterated. The margin between survival and collapse, though narrow, proves sufficient. Jones's contributions extend beyond beam warfare. His analytical methodology, collecting fragmentary intelligence, identifying patterns, developing countermeasures, becomes template for British technical intelligence throughout the war. When British planners develop deception operations for D-Day, they implement Jones's principles directly. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate strategy convincing Germany the Allied invasion targets Calais rather than Normandy, employs identical methods: false transmissions, misdirection, exploiting enemy confidence in their intelligence apparatus. The phantom army that maintained German divisions awaiting wrong beaches owes its conceptual foundation to phantom beams that directed German bombers toward empty terrain. British anti-submarine warfare transforms, utilizing techniques Jones pioneered. Identical signals intelligence that penetrated German beam systems helps decode U-boat communications and monitor their movements across the Atlantic. Identical analytical approach, fragments assembled into configurations revealing strategies, guides the campaign that ultimately neutralizes the submarine threat. Even Allied strategic bombing development incorporates beam war lessons. Understanding how Germany constructed precision guidance systems assists British and American planners developing their own. The electronic warfare capabilities Jones's team created defensively become offensive weapons, jamming German radar, confusing their air defenses, clearing approaches for bomber formations. By war's conclusion, electronic warfare has become permanent military strategy feature. The invisible spectrum, radio frequencies, radar bands, electronic signals, is now acknowledged as territory requiring contest and control, as strategically vital as physical geography. Every major military power constructs institutions dedicated to signals intelligence and electronic countermeasures. The discipline Jones essentially invented in his cramped Air Ministry office becomes cornerstone of modern defense. Dr. R.V. Jones survives the war. Many colleagues don't. Exhausted by stress, killed during raids, broken by relentless pressure of secret work that couldn't be acknowledged or discussed. Jones carries his own damage, though he rarely mentions it. The years of minimal rest and maximum stress leave permanent marks. Following the war, he returns to academic life, becoming professor of natural philosophy at the University of Aberdeen. He teaches. He conducts research. He attempts rebuilding normal existence after years of extraordinary circumstances. Yet the war never completely releases him. Government requests continue arriving. Cold War intelligence challenges require his analytical abilities. He advises on Soviet technical capabilities, assists developing British radar systems, consults on projects he can never discuss publicly. The young physicist who desired quiet academic career becomes one of Britain's most valued secret advisors, a connection between scientific understanding and national security. In 1978, he finally reveals his story. His book, Most Secret War, discloses for the first time the complete scope of the Beam War and Britain's electronic intelligence operations. The book becomes classic, still required reading for intelligence professionals decades later. Jones writes with clarity and restraint, more interested in explaining how problems were resolved than claiming personal recognition. When interviewers ask what motivated him, how he maintained conviction when everyone dismissed him, how he discovered strength to continue working when pressure seemed unbearable, his responses are characteristically humble. "I simply refused believing we couldn't outsmart them," he states in one interview. "The Germans were intelligent, very intelligent. However, they weren't infallible. Their systems contained vulnerabilities. Every system contains vulnerabilities. You simply must locate them." He dies in 1997, aged 86. By then, the technologies he pioneered have evolved beyond recognition. Stealth aircraft absorb radar signals utilizing principles that echo his countermeasure work. GPS satellites guide precision munitions with accuracy the Nicobene engineers could never have conceived. Electronic warfare has become so sophisticated that modern militaries invest billions on systems to attack and defend the invisible spectrum. All of it traces backward in some form to a 28-year-old physicist who heard a continuous tone at 31.5 megahertz on a dark November night in 1940. Consider what might have occurred. What would have occurred if Jones had surrendered? If the dismissals and rejections had shattered his conviction? If he'd accepted the expert consensus that German radio beams were fantasy? November 14, 1940, unfolds differently. 500 bombers approach Coventry, guided by invisible beams nobody is seeking. They devastate the city precisely as they did in our timeline. However, there's no Jones in the cabinet war room explaining what he's discovered. No Churchill ordering countermeasures. No headache or bromide or meekening. The subsequent raid strikes Birmingham with complete precision. Then Manchester. Then Liverpool. Every industrial city in Britain falls under surgical bombardment. Factories producing Spitfires and tanks and ammunition are systematically eliminated. The production capacity enabling Britain to fight is steadily destroyed. Perhaps Britain still endures. The Channel remains a formidable barrier, and German invasion forces faced enormous logistical obstacles. However, the margin between survival and defeat narrows. The American assistance that eventually reverses the tide arrives to a nation more battered, more depleted, less capable of resistance. The war extends longer. More people perish. History pivots on the persistence of one young scientist who refused abandoning his belief he was correct. That's the lesson embedded in this story. Not that science wins wars, though it frequently does. Not that technology matters, though it always has. The lesson is simpler and harder. Sometimes the person who perceives what everyone else overlooks is the only person who can preserve what everyone else assumes is secure. Jones wasn't exceptional because he was more intelligent than his colleagues. The senior officers who dismissed him weren't foolish. They were experienced professionals applying reasonable skepticism to extraordinary assertions. Their error wasn't intellectual, it was imaginative. They couldn't conceive of technology that contradicted their assumptions about what was possible. Jones could, and that imaginative leap, supported by stubborn conviction and relentless work, transformed everything. The outsiders who refused surrendering, the voices dismissed as irrational until events proved them right. History is shaped by these individuals more frequently than we acknowledge. We construct monuments for generals and politicians. We should construct more for the analysts and scientists and engineers who perceive threats nobody else recognizes and fight battles nobody else comprehends. Dr. R.V. Jones saw invisible beams, and because he refused stopping his search, Britain survived to witness victory. If you want to discover how another underdog inventor changed the course of battle, a sergeant with no engineering degree who rescued D-Day with scrap metal and a blowtorch, subscribe and hit the bell. That story arrives next week. A damaged tank, an impossible idea. 48 hours to construct something that Eisenhower called the most important invention of the war. Trust me, it's even more incredible than this one.